The room went silent, because no one expected the freshman representative to fight back like this. It was supposed to be routine, just another day in the marble halls where power is measured in titles and tenure. Senators leaned back in their leather chairs, journalists hunched over their laptops, cameras blinked red as they caught every micro-expression. And then, with the weight of decades in politics, Mitt Romney leaned forward, eyes narrowing, lips curling into that half-smile that carried the scent of condescension. "So tell us, Representative Crockett," he began, his voice slow, deliberate, the cadence of someone used to being obeyed. "With so little experience, why should anyone here take your perspective seriously?" It wasn't just a question. It was a dismissal wrapped in civility, a dagger slid under the table. The kind of rhetorical weapon politicians of Romney's stature had used for generations, a reminder of hierarchy, a warning to know your place. Crockett didn't flinch. She sat still, shoulders squared, her eyes locked on his. Around them, the atmosphere thickened. You could almost hear the collective intake of breath. This was more than a question about experience. This was a message to her, to every young legislator, every woman, every person of color who dared step onto the national stage: you don't belong here. Reporters exchanged glances, pens pausing mid-sentence. In the gallery, whispers spread like sparks on dry grass. Romney's tone wasn't subtle, it carried the weight of dismissal, the arrogance of pedigree. He leaned back, clearly satisfied, as though he'd just delivered a lesson to an eager student. But Jasmine Crockett wasn't an eager student. She was a fighter, forged outside the comfort of country clubs and legacy names. And though she hadn't spoken yet, something in her expression shifted. Her silence wasn't submission, it was calculation. The tension was unbearable. One side of the chamber wore smirks, anticipating an awkward stammer. The other bristled, waiting, hoping she'd strike back. Every second of silence screamed louder than the last. And then came the moment no one foresaw. Crockett leaned slightly forward, her lips parting just enough for the microphone to catch her breath. What she was about to say wouldn't just answer Romney's jab. It would rewrite the balance of the room. Because what happened next didn't just silence Romney, it sent shockwaves through Washington. On the surface, it looked like just another tense moment in a hearing, a senator questioning a representative, a senior figure pressing a newcomer. But beneath that polite exchange, the stakes were seismic. Because this wasn't just Mitt Romney, the seasoned GOP elder, speaking down to Jasmine Crockett. This was the embodiment of an old order, a political dynasty telling the new generation where it belonged. And the question of experience wasn't really about qualifications, it was about power, who gets to hold it, and who gets told to wait their turn. Romney's words echoed with the weight of decades in Washington. He was no rookie, he was a presidential nominee, a name etched into the history of American politics. For his supporters, he symbolized stability, tradition, the calm hand of establishment wisdom. And that made his dismissal sting even deeper, because it was never just about Crockett alone. It was about anyone who had ever been underestimated, told to sit quietly, or labeled too green to matter. Jasmine Crockett walked into that chamber not with the comfort of pedigree, but with the grit of someone who had fought tooth and nail to get there. She wasn't supposed to have a seat at this table, at least not according to the unwritten rules Romney was invoking. She was young. She was black. She was a freshman Democrat representing the kind of America that establishment voices often talked about but rarely listened to. And now she was being challenged not on her ideas, but on her very right to speak. That's why the moment mattered. Because when Romney questioned her experience, he was really questioning something larger, whether voices like hers belonged in the highest halls of power. And in that instant, Crockett became more than just herself. She became a proxy for every underdog, every newcomer, every voice America has tried to push to the margins. The tension that hung in the chamber reflected something bigger happening across the nation. This wasn't just about politics, it was about culture. Who gets to lead? Who gets heard? Who is dismissed with a smirk before they even finish their first sentence? It was the eternal battle between the established order and the rising voices demanding their place. And yet, there was something Romney didn't anticipate. He expected silence, maybe defensiveness, maybe even an embarrassed retreat. He expected the freshman representative to wilt under the glare of the spotlight, to bow to the weight of his reputation. What he didn't expect was resistance. What he didn't expect was fire. Because Crockett wasn't sitting in that chamber to play defense. She came armed not with years of insider privilege, but with lived experience, real struggle, and the kind of authenticity that can cut sharper than any resume. And as Romney leaned back, content with his jab, the cameras zoomed in on her face. There was no hesitation, no fear, no hint of retreat. Only calm resolve. Across America, viewers who would later watch the clip didn't just see two politicians, they saw a clash of eras. The voice of privilege pressing down, and the voice of resilience rising up. The stakes had grown beyond a single exchange. They had become a battle over dignity itself. And as Romney doubled down, pressing his advantage with the smugness of a man convinced he had already won, Jasmine Crockett prepared a response that no one in the chamber saw coming. Romney entered the chamber with decades of power behind him, and he wielded it like a weapon. For much of his career, Mitt Romney had been the picture of the American political establishment. Born into privilege, son of a governor, heir to a dynasty of wealth and influence, he never had to claw for a seat at the table. The doors of politics, business, and elite society swung open long before he ever knocked. To many, he represented stability, the clean-cut executive, the dignified politician, the man whose name carried weight in boardrooms and Senate chambers alike. But beneath that polished exterior lay something else, the arrogance of entitlement. Romney often spoke of civility, about the need for respect in public discourse, about the virtues of dignity and composure. And yet, time and again, his own actions betrayed that very message. To him, respect seemed less a universal standard than a weapon to wield selectively. With allies, he could be gracious. With opponents, especially those younger, less connected, or less seasoned, his civility could vanish, replaced by sharp jabs delivered with a smile. That "father knows best" aura had long been his trademark. He spoke as if teaching lessons, not engaging in debate. He exuded the air of someone who believed wisdom was his birthright, experience his shield, and authority his natural state. For some, this posture radiated calm leadership. For others, it reeked of elitism, of the quiet disdain that powerful men show when they believe the hierarchy of society is fixed in their favor. Romney's contradictions were glaring. He positioned himself as a moral compass, yet often spoke in ways that belittled those who didn't share his worldview. He painted himself as the defender of American values, yet his career had been propped up by the very privileges and connections that most Americans could never dream of accessing. He could preach humility while standing atop a mountain built by his father's name, his inherited wealth, and the pathways carved by generations of power. This duality followed him into every chamber he entered. The cameras loved him, the salt and pepper hair, the stately posture, the reassuring cadence. But beneath that cinematic veneer, his rivals saw the pattern, dismissiveness toward challengers, especially women and people of color, wrapped in a cloak of courtesy that made it all the more insidious. He didn't need to shout or rage, his smirk did the work for him. His questions weren't designed to enlighten, but to diminish. And in this moment with Jasmine Crockett, that pattern was on full display. Romney didn't attack her policies or her arguments, he went straight for her legitimacy. It was the oldest tactic in the book for men of his stature: don't debate the idea, question whether the person offering it has the right to be in the room at all. What made Romney's arrogance sting so sharply was its familiarity. America had seen it countless times before: the boardroom boss explaining why the young employee wasn't ready, the professor who dismisses a student's perspective because of inexperience, the politician who pats a challenger on the head while warning them to be patient. It was arrogance dressed as wisdom, condescension disguised as mentorship. But Romney's aura of invincibility was beginning to show cracks. Because the America sitting in that chamber in 2023 was not the America of his rise. The voices he dismissed were no longer silent. The generations he brushed aside had grown louder, bolder, unwilling to wait their turn. His old guard confidence was colliding with a new wave of leaders who weren't asking for permission, they were taking their place. And Jasmine Crockett represented everything Romney had underestimated. She wasn't molded by legacy or wealth. She wasn't carrying the shield of pedigree or dynasty. She was carrying lived struggle, community roots, and the kind of grit that can't be polished into a resume. Romney didn't see it yet. In his mind, this was just another lesson to deliver, another young legislator to set straight. He leaned back, believing his words had landed with the finality of a gavel. But the truth was, the room hadn't settled into his authority. It was bracing for something else. Because in under 5 minutes, that armor of experience would begin to crack. Jasmine Crockett did not arrive in Washington by accident, she fought for every inch. Long before her name was etched on congressional placards or echoed in national headlines, she was a young woman standing in courtrooms most Americans never see, fighting for those most Americans never hear. She began not with privilege, but with purpose. While others were born into dynasties, Crockett carved her path from the ground up, the daughter of a working-class family that taught her that dignity wasn't given, it was earned in struggle. Her rise began in grassroots battles, not marble halls. In cramped offices and crowded community centers, she listened to the stories of neighbors who couldn't afford lawyers, people who had been silenced by a system designed to overlook them. When most aspiring politicians were polishing resumes with internships and connections, Crockett was standing shoulder to shoulder with those who had none. Civil rights law became her weapon, her shield, her calling. She defended the voiceless, those accused without resources, those beaten down by bureaucracy. Every case was a fight against systems tilted in favor of wealth and power. And each victory, no matter how small, hardened her resolve. This was not about climbing ladders of prestige. It was about lifting people who had been told they would never stand. What set her apart was not just her skill, but her refusal to bow. In courtrooms, when prosecutors towered over her, she didn't shrink. In debates, when seasoned opponents tried to rattle her, she stared them down with fire in her eyes. Her authenticity was her armor, she never hid where she came from, never softened her edges to fit neatly into the mold carved by others. She spoke with the cadence of her community, unapologetic, rooted in truth. And that made her dangerous to the establishment. Because authenticity cannot be bought, and grit cannot be manufactured. Crockett's journey was filled with uphill battles. She was underestimated again and again, too young, too blunt, too unwilling to play the game by the old rules. She heard it whispered in political circles, that she was too raw, too unpolished, too unseasoned to stand on the big stage. But what they dismissed as flaws were, in reality, her greatest strengths. Every slight fueled her determination. Every dismissal reminded her why she was fighting in the first place. Her sacrifices were not abstract, they were personal. Long hours meant missed moments with family. Every campaign dollar was hard-earned, raised not from wealthy donors but from ordinary people who believed in her fire. She carried not just her own ambitions but the weight of every young woman who had been told to sit down, every person of color who had been told to wait their turn, every working-class American who had been told their dreams didn't belong in Washington. That weight could have crushed her. Instead, it propelled her. When she finally stepped onto the national stage, she did so with the strength of those battles carved into her spirit. Unlike many of her colleagues, her story wasn't polished in private schools or protected by family legacies. Her story was written in sweat, sacrifice, and the stubborn refusal to yield. That authenticity radiated in every speech, every hearing, every glance into the camera. She became, in many ways, a champion for everyday America, not the America of gilded boardrooms, but the America of kitchen tables and long commutes, of workers juggling 2 jobs, of immigrants chasing the promise that dignity is worth fighting for. She spoke in a way that resonated because she wasn't just speaking for herself, she was voicing the struggles of millions who rarely saw themselves represented in the halls of Congress. Her presence in Washington was living proof that the old gatekeepers couldn't keep the doors shut forever. She embodied the reality that persistence and courage could breach barriers that privilege had guarded for centuries. And that is why Romney's dismissal stung so deeply. Because his words weren't just about one woman's experience, they were about erasing the blood, sweat, and sacrifice it had taken for her to get there. He wanted to reduce her to a resume line. But her story was never about paper credentials. It was about battles fought, lives defended, dignity demanded. She had been underestimated before, and every time, she had proven them wrong. This chamber would be no different. Because Jasmine Crockett's entire journey was preparing her for this very kind of moment, a confrontation where the old guard smirked, certain of victory, and she stood tall, carrying the voices of those who had no seat at the table. Her silence as Romney questioned her wasn't fear, it was the pause before the storm. A storm born from years of dismissal, years of sacrifice, years of climbing uphill while being told she didn't belong. And when that storm broke, it would not just shake one senator's confidence, it would reverberate far beyond the walls of that chamber. Because that fight, the one she had carried her whole life, was about to ignite in a moment no one would forget. The exchange should have ended with Romney's first jab. A question posed, a polite nod, the conversation moving on. But Romney wasn't finished. He leaned forward again, his voice sharper this time, less the polished statesman and more the seasoned interrogator pressing his advantage. Representative Crockett, he repeated, stretching out her title as if to remind everyone in the room how new it sounded. With such limited time in public office, I'm struggling to see what qualifies you to speak on matters that seasoned legislators have wrestled with for decades. There it was again, that word, limited. He let it linger in the air, a blade glinting under the lights. The smirk returned, that quiet certainty that he had already won this exchange before it truly began. Around him, a few senators nodded faintly, their expressions saying what their lips didn't, she should know her place. Crockett didn't move. She didn't fumble with papers or glance down at her notes. She simply listened, her expression composed, though in her eyes there burned something fiercer than patience. Calm on the surface, fire underneath, the look of someone who had weathered storms far worse than a condescending lecture in a marble chamber. The room itself seemed to sense the rising tension. Murmurs rippled across the audience. Staffers shifted in their seats. Journalists poised their pens, waiting to catch the quote that might turn into tomorrow's headline. Camera lenses narrowed in, hungry to capture the flicker of conflict that was about to erupt. Romney pressed again, doubling down. It's not just about passion, Representative. It's about years of service, about understanding the complexities of governance. This isn't the place for, he stopped short, but the implication hung heavy, for amateurs. The word was never spoken, but everyone heard it. Some even smiled at the cruelty disguised as wisdom. To them, this was classic Romney, the elder statesman putting the novice in her place. But others bristled. They had seen this act before. They had felt it in their own lives, in boardrooms, in classrooms, in workplaces where authority disguised itself as benevolence. Crockett's silence grew louder with every passing second. She didn't rush to defend herself. She didn't interrupt. Instead, she let Romney's words pile up, brick by brick, constructing a tower of arrogance so tall that when it toppled, the fall would be spectacular. The silence was unnerving. Reporters glanced at one another, unsure if she would fold or fight. A camera caught the brief tightening of Romney's jaw as he leaned back, satisfied that his point had landed. The old guard had spoken, the lesson was complete. But Crockett's stillness was not submission. It was strategy. In that silence, she gathered not just her thoughts, but the weight of her entire journey. Every courtroom she had stood in, every client she had defended, every door she had kicked open despite being told it was locked, all of it surged inside her like a tide ready to break. The chamber grew restless. A cough echoed from the back. The faint clicking of keyboards picked up as journalists sensed the moment approaching. Some in the audience leaned forward, eyes narrowing, waiting to see whether the freshman representative would falter or rise. And then, in that heartbeat between insult and response, the atmosphere shifted. Crockett moved. It wasn't dramatic at first, just a subtle lean forward, her hand steady, her gaze unflinching. But the gesture carried with it the unmistakable weight of intention. She was no longer merely listening. She was preparing to strike. The microphone seemed to buzz faintly, ready to catch her voice. The whispers died down. The smirks began to fade. Even Romney, perhaps sensing something he hadn't anticipated, straightened in his chair. The entire chamber froze, suspended between arrogance and rebuttal, between dismissal and defiance. The silence became absolute, the kind of silence that announces not the end of an exchange, but the beginning of something unforgettable. Then, Crockett leaned into the mic, and Washington held its breath. The microphone caught the faintest breath before Jasmine Crockett began. She didn't rush. She didn't stumble. Her voice came low, steady, deliberate, the tone of someone who had been underestimated her entire life and had learned to make every word count. "Senator Romney," she began, the syllables clear and unwavering, "I hear your concern about experience. So let me tell you what that word means where I come from." The chamber stilled. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried. Each phrase landed like the measured steps of someone crossing a battlefield with calm assurance. "I didn't come to this chamber through family names or inherited influence. I didn't arrive here because the path was carved for me by generations of privilege. My experience doesn't come from leather chairs and marble hallways. It comes from courtrooms where the air conditioning barely worked, where I stood beside people who couldn't afford an attorney, people who were told by this system that their voices didn't matter. My experience is measured in the lives I've fought for." Gasps whispered through the gallery. Pens scratched furiously. The journalists who had leaned back moments before were now hunched forward, every syllable an arrow they scrambled to capture. Romney's smirk faded, ever so slightly. He hadn't expected calm precision. He had expected nerves, excuses, perhaps defensiveness. Instead, Crockett was laying down a foundation, a story that reached beyond her and into the lives of countless Americans watching. She pressed forward, her voice gaining momentum. "I've represented the voiceless, men and women whose only crime was being born into poverty, into neighborhoods ignored until election season. I've stood with mothers begging for justice after their children were taken too soon. I've fought against landlords who treated tenants like numbers on a page instead of human beings trying to survive. That is where my experience lives. In the trenches. On the ground. With the people." The chamber shifted. The murmurs that had once carried amusement now held awe, even discomfort. Senators glanced at one another. Staffers typed furiously. On social media, the clip was already being clipped, subtitled, uploaded, Twitter fingers flying as hashtags prepared to ignite. And then, Crockett pivoted. Her voice sharpened, her cadence rising. "Senator, you speak of years in office, of decades in power. But let's be honest about what those years have meant. Experience in Washington too often looks like sitting comfortably while ordinary people bear the cost. Experience in Washington means learning how to dismiss those who haven't walked the same marble corridors. Experience in Washington means forgetting that politics isn't about you, it's about the people you claim to serve." Romney's jaw tightened. He shifted slightly in his chair, his confident posture beginning to betray unease. This wasn't the freshman representative fumbling under pressure. This was a cross-examination, and he was on the stand. Crockett leaned in closer, her words now cutting with precision. "So let me be crystal clear. My experience is not measured in years of speeches, or in titles held, or in the size of a donor list. My experience is measured in the clients who walked free because I fought for them when no one else would. In the families who slept easier because someone finally stood up to their landlords. In the young people who looked at me and realized they, too, could fight a system that told them to sit down and be quiet." The crescendo built. Her eyes never left Romney's. Her tone carried both fire and grace. Experience isn't measured by years in a leather chair. It's measured by the lives you've touched and the people you've fought for. The words hung in the air like thunder. A ripple spread across the chamber, gasps, nods, even a few murmurs of agreement from unlikely corners. The sound of fingers typing furiously filled the room as journalists pushed the quote onto screens that would beam it to millions within minutes. Romney swallowed hard. The smugness was gone, replaced by a flicker of something rarer for him, discomfort. He adjusted his papers, shifted in his seat, but there was no hiding the shift in the power dynamic. He had thrown his weight like a hammer, and Crockett had caught it with her bare hands, snapped it in two, and hurled it back with the force of lived truth. And Crockett wasn't finished. She drove the point deeper, each line a nail in the coffin of condescension. You ask why my voice matters here. It matters because America is changing. It matters because this chamber should not just be for those born into privilege or cushioned by wealth. It matters because I represent the very people this body has ignored for far too long. That is my qualification. That is my experience. And no amount of smirks will erase it. The room seemed to exhale, as if stunned by the force of what had just been unleashed. Reporters shook their heads in disbelief, whispering to each other even as their fingers flew across keyboards. Social media exploded in real time, hashtags erupting, the phrase, experience isn't measured by years in a leather chair, already stamped across tweets, memes, and TikTok captions. Romney's face tightened further. His jaw locked, his hands fidgeted with his notes, but he didn't speak. For the first time in the exchange, he looked less like the teacher and more like the student who had just been schooled in front of the entire class. The aura of invincibility he carried into the room was cracking, piece by piece, under the weight of Crockett's truth. The narrator's voice might as well have been echoing through the marble walls. In a single answer, Crockett turned the chamber into her courtroom, and Romney into the defendant. The silence that followed was deafening. Cameras zoomed in on Romney's face, capturing every flicker of discomfort, every forced smile. Crockett, meanwhile, leaned back ever so slightly, her expression calm, almost serene, as if she had simply told the truth and let it stand on its own. What no one in that chamber fully understood yet was that this moment was already bigger than the room. The words she had spoken would not remain trapped within those four walls. They were already escaping, already flying across screens and into living rooms across America. They were being shared, celebrated, dissected, repeated. And while Romney sat in silence, Crockett's words had already made her voice louder than he could have imagined. But this was only the beginning, because the world outside that room was about to explode. The moment the clip hit the internet, the explosion was immediate. Within minutes, Twitter feeds lit up with disbelief and delight. Hashtags shot to the top of the trending list, hashtag Crockett Clapback, hashtag Speechless Romney, and hashtag Experience Defined. Users clipped the exact moment Romney's smirk slipped and Crockett delivered her line about experience not being measured by years in a leather chair. The phrase became a rallying cry, repeated, remixed, and repurposed across every platform. On TikTok, creators wasted no time. Side-by-side reaction videos showed young women nodding in solidarity, teachers applauding from their classrooms, workers pausing mid-shift to record their own amen. One video showed a young law student mouthing Crockett's words with captions flashing, "This is why we fight. This is why representation matters." Another stitched Romney's question into a montage of bosses, professors, and politicians dismissing people, followed by Crockett's mic drop as the triumphant rebuttal. Millions of views piled up overnight. Memes spread like wildfire. A still shot of Romney's tightened jaw became the internet's newest reaction image, captioned with everything from, "When you realize you underestimated the wrong one," to, "That face when the freshman brings receipts." Crockett's quote was emblazoned over images of factory workers, nurses, teachers, ordinary Americans claiming their own form of experience. In less than a day, it had leapt from a congressional chamber into popular culture. Late-night talk shows seized on it instantly. Monologues replayed the clip to laughter and applause. One host quipped, Mitt Romney asked for her credentials, and Jasmine Crockett handed him his resignation letter. Another compared her composure to a heavyweight champion, noting how she let him swing, then dropped him with one punch. But it wasn't just entertainment. Commentators across the political spectrum were forced to react. Progressive voices hailed Crockett as the future of leadership, unbought, unbent, unafraid. Liberal columnists praised her ability to reframe the debate away from Washington's obsession with tenure and toward the moral weight of lived struggle. Even moderates who had never heard her name before admitted she had seized the spotlight with remarkable precision. On the other side, conservative pundits scrambled. Some downplayed the exchange as political theater, others accused her of being disrespectful to a senior senator. But even they couldn't ignore the virality. They were debating on Crockett's turf now, responding to her words, amplifying her message even as they tried to undercut it. And then came the voices that mattered most, ordinary people. Across America, individuals shared the clip with captions that read like personal confessions. This is what I've wanted to say to every boss who dismissed me. This is why we need fresh voices in Washington. Finally, someone said what we've all been waiting to hear. It wasn't just about Romney anymore. It was about every power dynamic where the established order told someone younger, poorer, or less connected that they weren't qualified to speak. Crockett had given words to a frustration millions carried in silence. And the applause came not just from partisans, but from people who recognized themselves in her defiance. News outlets picked up on the story, running headlines like, Freshman Representative Silences Romney in Viral Exchange, and, Crockett Redefines What Experience Means in Congress. Cable networks replayed the footage in endless loops, breaking down her tone, her body language, the exact second Romney's composure faltered. Analysts noted that she had turned a potential moment of humiliation into a showcase of strength, and in doing so, had shifted the narrative in her favor. Even celebrities joined the chorus. Musicians tweeted her quote. Athletes reposted the clip with emojis of clapping hands. One actress wrote, if you've ever been dismissed as too young, too inexperienced, or too different, Jasmine Crockett just spoke for you. The ripple effect grew. College debate teams studied the exchange. High school classrooms discussed it. Grassroots organizations used the clip in fundraising emails, framing Crockett as proof that underdogs could rise. Within days, what started as a pointed question in a chamber had become a cultural moment, a flashpoint in America's ongoing battle between old power and new voices. And yet, amid all the celebration, the applause, the hashtags, one question lingered like smoke after a fire. It wasn't just about what Crockett had said, it was about what it meant. Because beyond the viral moment lay a deeper conflict, a struggle not only between two politicians but between two visions of America. And as the applause spread across the country, one question remained, what was the deeper meaning of this clash? In the days that followed, as the clip continued to surge across every corner of the internet, something remarkable happened. The conversation stopped being about a single exchange between Mitt Romney and Jasmine Crockett. It grew larger, heavier, more resonant. Because what Crockett had done wasn't simply rebut a senator. She had reframed an entire narrative, one that has followed Americans for generations. Her words reminded people that dignity always outweighs elitism, that lived struggle carries more truth than inherited privilege. She took Romney's attempt to belittle her and turned it into a universal declaration, experience is not the property of the powerful, it belongs to everyone who has endured, who has fought, who has survived. This was never just Romney versus Crockett. This was the boardroom meeting where a young woman's idea is brushed aside until a senior man repeats it. This was the immigrant worker told they don't understand how things are done here. This was the student dismissed for being too idealistic, the activist called too radical, the newcomer told to wait their turn. Crockett's moment became their moment, a living reminder that being underestimated can be the spark for transformation. Her courage offered a mirror to the audience watching. It wasn't about politics anymore. It was about them. About the millions who carry invisible resumes written not on paper but in sweat, sacrifice, and grit. It was about the factory worker who has endured grueling shifts, the mother who has balanced 3 jobs to keep the lights on, the first-generation student who has fought for a seat in classrooms designed to exclude them. Each of them could see themselves in Crockett's words. Each could feel the validation of knowing that their stories mattered. And that became the moral crescendo of the moment. Power doesn't reside only in pedigrees, titles, or years spent in plush offices. True power lives in authenticity, in resilience, in the courage to speak when silence is demanded. Crockett reminded the country that authority is not bestowed by those already in power, it is claimed by those willing to rise. The beauty of her response was not just in what she said to Romney, but in what she unlocked for everyone watching. She gave people permission to claim their own experience as valid, their own voices as necessary, their own presence as undeniable. She made it clear that no one has the right to define your worth except you. And that's why the moment soared beyond headlines. Because in Crockett's calm defiance, people felt the truth of their own struggles reflected back at them. Her victory in that chamber became their victory in classrooms, workplaces, communities across the nation. It became proof that even when the establishment smirks, even when the old guard sneers, the underdog can rise, and when they do, they change the entire narrative. This story, in the end, wasn't about humiliation or revenge. It was about reclamation. Reclaiming the right to belong. Reclaiming the dignity that so many are told they lack. Reclaiming the power that comes not from years in elite spaces, but from the resilience of living and refusing to bow. So when the dust settled, when the hashtags slowed, the message remained. It was simple, but it was profound. Your story is your qualification. Your struggle is your strength. Your journey, no matter how unrecognized by the powerful, is proof that you belong. Because when someone tries to diminish you, remember, your story is your power. Mitt Romney questioned Jasmine Crockett's experience, but in the end, it was he who was left speechless. What began as a condescending attempt to diminish her turned into a defining moment that revealed a larger truth: resilience, authenticity, and lived struggle will always carry more weight than elitism wrapped in privilege. Crockett didn't just defend herself, she stood for every person who has ever been dismissed, overlooked, or told they weren't ready. Her voice in that chamber became a reminder that truth doesn't need a pedigree, and dignity doesn't ask for permission. And in that moment, America saw not just a freshman congresswoman, but the embodiment of a universal story, the underdog rising, the silence speaking, the underestimated proving everyone wrong. That is why this exchange matters. Because it reminds us that the battles we face in our daily lives, the moments when someone questions our worth or tries to erase our contributions, are not small. They are part of a larger fight for recognition, respect, and justice. And every time someone like Jasmine Crockett refuses to bow, it lights the path for the rest of us. So here's the call to action: if you believe in voices like Jasmine Crockett's, share this story. Share it with your friends, your family, your community. Share it because the world needs to hear it. Let it be a reminder that power does not belong only to the privileged few, it belongs to anyone brave enough to stand in their truth. This is more than politics. It's about who we are, and who we choose to be. And tonight, America chose to remember that courage, when spoken aloud, can silence even the loudest doubt.